The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the busy intersection where people hurried about their day. Cars honked impatiently as traffic lights flickered between red and green. Among the chaos stood Officer Greg Carson, a tall man with broad shoulders and an air of authority that made heads turn. He had been patrolling this neighborhood for years, known for his sharp uniform, stern voice, and no-nonsense attitude. But today, something felt off. Greg's attention was drawn to a man standing near the curb. A black man wearing a faded jacket and scuffed shoes. His hair was slightly unkempt, and he carried a small duffel bag slung over one shoulder. The man seemed lost in thought, staring at the ground as if trying to avoid drawing attention to himself. To Greg, he looked like someone who didn't belong here, someone out of place in this part of town. "Hey, you," Greg barked, his tone cutting through the noise of the street. The man glanced up, startled, his dark eyes meeting Greg's cold glare. "What are you doing just standing there? You causing trouble?" The man shook his head slowly, raising his hand slightly in a gesture of peace. "No, sir," he replied calmly. "I'm waiting for the light to change." But Greg wasn't satisfied. Something about the man rubbed him the wrong way. His quiet demeanor, the way he kept his gaze lowered, almost as if he were deliberately avoiding eye contact. In Greg's mind, it all added up to disrespect, and disrespect was something he wouldn't tolerate, not from anyone. "You think you can just stand there and ignore me?" Greg snapped, stepping closer. His boots clicked against the pavement, each step echoing louder than the last. By now, a small crowd had gathered, curious onlookers pausing to watch the unfolding scene. Some whispered among themselves. Others pulled out their phones to record what was happening. The man tried again, his voice steady but soft. "Officer, I'm not ignoring you. I'm just waiting to cross the street." Greg sneered, his patience wearing thin. "Waiting, huh? Or maybe you're casing the area, looking for your next move." He leaned in closer, invading the man's personal space. "People like you always have something up their sleeves." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and accusatory. The man didn't respond, choosing instead to hold Greg's gaze with quiet resolve. It was clear he wasn't going to argue or fight back. But rather than diffusing the tension, his silence only fueled Greg's anger further. Before anyone could react, Greg did something shocking. He spat on the man. A glob of saliva landed on the man's cheek, glistening under the dimming sunlight. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by murmurs of disbelief. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The man simply wiped his face with the back of his hand, his expression unreadable. Then, without saying another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the sea of pedestrians. Greg straightened up, feeling a mix of satisfaction and irritation. He told himself he'd done the right thing, that he put the man in his place. What he didn't realize was that this brief, ugly encounter would soon spiral into something far bigger than he could ever imagine. Little did he know, the man he had humiliated wasn't just any stranger. He was someone whose life was about to intersect with Greg's in ways neither of them could predict. By the time Greg returned to the precinct later that evening, news of the incident had already spread like wildfire. Officers huddled in small groups around the break room, their voices low but urgent as they discussed what had happened. Some recounted details they'd heard from witnesses, while others speculated about how such an event could occur in broad daylight. The tension in the air was palpable, a mix of disbelief, anger, and unease. "Did you hear about Carson?" One officer whispered to another, glancing toward the door to make sure no supervisors were nearby. "Word is, he lost it on some guy at the intersection today." "Yeah, I saw the video," the second officer replied, shaking his head. "It's all over social media. People are calling for his badge." Greg walked into the room just as the conversation reached its peak. He tried to ignore the stares and murmurs, pretending not to notice how quickly the chatter died down when he entered. Instead, he poured himself a cup of coffee, leaning casually against the counter as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, his stomach churned with unease. He knew better than anyone how fast rumors could escalate and how damaging they could be. Meanwhile, online platforms buzzed with activity. A bystander's shaky cell phone footage captured the entire confrontation. Greg's aggressive body language, the man's calm response, and finally, the moment Greg spat on him. The clip racked up thousands of views within hours, accompanied by outraged comments from viewers who demanded accountability. Hashtags like #JusticeForRespect and #PolicyReformNow began trending locally, sparking heated debates about racism, power dynamics, and police conduct. Back at the station, the atmosphere grew heavier as the day wore on. Captain Lewis called Greg into his office for a private meeting. The captain, a grizzled veteran nearing retirement, sat behind his cluttered desk with a furrowed brow. He gestured for Greg to close the door before speaking. "You've got yourself in a real mess this time," Captain Lewis said bluntly, sliding a printed copy of the viral video across the desk. "This isn't just some minor complaint we can sweep under the rug. Folks are angry. Really angry." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, avoiding eye contact. "Sir, I was just doing my job. That guy was being disrespectful, and I needed to assert authority." Captain Lewis sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Asserting authority doesn't mean losing your cool, Greg. You know that. And right now, the timing couldn't be worse." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "We're expecting a new chief any day now. Word is, they're bringing in someone young, progressive, someone focused on reform. If this blows up further, it'll reflect badly on the whole department." Greg frowned, feeling a twinge of irritation. "So what am I supposed to do? Apologize to the whole city?" "No," Captain Lewis replied firmly. "But you'd better start thinking about damage control. Because trust me, whoever this new chief is, they won't take kindly to incidents like this." As Greg left the office, he couldn't shake the feeling that something big was looming on the horizon. Rumors continued to swirl about the incoming chief, a mysterious figure whose name hadn't yet been officially announced. Some officers claimed the person came from a background in community policing, while others whispered about ties to civil rights organizations. Whoever it was, they were expected to shake things up, and Greg couldn't help but wonder how much trouble he might be in once they arrived. Despite his bravado earlier, doubt crept into Greg's mind. Had he crossed a line he couldn't come back from? Or was this just another storm that would pass with time? For now, all he could do was wait and hope that the fallout wouldn't cost him everything. The following Monday, the police department buzzed with anticipation as officers gathered in the main auditorium for a highly anticipated announcement. The retiring commissioner had officially stepped down over the weekend, leaving behind an empty chair at the head of the table, a seat that would soon be filled by the new chief. Whispers echoed through the room as everyone speculated about who the mystery leader might be. Some hoped for someone lenient, while others braced themselves for a strict reformer. Greg sat near the back of the room, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. He tried to appear calm, but his mind was racing. Over the past few days, the video of his altercation had only gained more traction online, and the backlash showed no signs of slowing down. Every time he logged onto social media or turned on the news, there it was, his face splashed across screens, accompanied by calls for accountability. He couldn't help but feel like the entire world was watching, waiting to see how this new chapter would unfold. Finally, the doors at the front of the auditorium swung open, and a man walked in. He moved with purpose, his steps measured and confident. Dressed in a sharp suit with a badge clipped neatly to his lapel, he exuded authority without being intimidating. As he approached the podium, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Greg squinted, trying to get a better look. Something about the man seemed familiar, though he couldn't quite place him. "Good morning," the man began, his voice smooth and commanding yet warm enough to put people at ease. "My name is Marcus Thompson, and I am honored to serve as your new chief of police." The room erupted into polite applause, though several officers exchanged uneasy glances. Greg froze, his blood running cold as realization dawned on him. It was him, the man from the intersection, the one he'd humiliated just days ago. His stomach churned as memories of the incident flooded back. The confrontation, the spitting, the way the crowd had gasped in shock. How could he not have recognized him earlier? Marcus didn't acknowledge Greg right away. Instead, he launched into a speech about his vision for the department, about rebuilding trust with the community, addressing systemic issues, and fostering a culture of respect and integrity. His words were inspiring, painting a picture of hope and progress. But Greg barely heard any of it. All he could focus on was the weight of Marcus's presence, the quiet authority that commanded attention without needing to shout. As Marcus spoke, he occasionally scanned the room, making eye contact with various officers. When his gaze landed on Greg, it lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. For a brief moment, their eyes locked, and Greg felt exposed, as though Marcus could see straight through him. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, suddenly hyper-aware of every movement, every breath. When the meeting ended, Greg lingered behind, unsure whether to approach Marcus or slip out unnoticed. In the end, he chose the latter, slipping quietly toward the exit. But even as he left the auditorium, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Marcus's arrival marked the beginning of something new, something unpredictable. And for Greg, it meant facing consequences he hadn't fully prepared for. Little did Greg know, Marcus already had plans for him, plans that would force him to confront not only his actions, but also the beliefs and biases that had driven them. Change was coming, and there was no escaping it. The days following Marcus Thompson's introduction as the new police chief were tense, especially for Greg Carson. The weight of what had happened, and the fact that Marcus now held ultimate authority over him, loomed large in his mind. He tried to go about his duties as usual, but it felt like every interaction carried an undercurrent of scrutiny. Fellow officers gave him sideways glances, some offering sympathetic nods while others avoided him altogether. Rumors swirled about how Marcus might handle the situation, and Greg couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking on thin ice. Then came the announcement. Chief Thompson had called for a mandatory assembly within the week. The memo stated that the meeting would focus on rebuilding trust and accountability, but everyone knew it wasn't going to be just another routine briefing. Officers whispered nervously in the hallways, speculating whether Greg's incident would take center stage. For Greg, the anticipation was unbearable. Each passing hour felt like a countdown to Judgment Day. When the day of the assembly arrived, the auditorium was packed. Rows of blue uniforms filled the space, their owners shifting uncomfortably in their seats. The air buzzed with quiet murmurs until Marcus walked in, commanding immediate silence. His presence was magnetic, calm yet authoritative, radiating a sense of purpose that demanded respect. As he stepped up to the podium, the room fell completely still. Marcus began by addressing the department's mission to serve and protect, emphasizing the importance of earning public trust. His words were measured, his tone steady, but there was no mistaking the underlying seriousness of the message. Then, without warning, he shifted gears. "I want to share something personal with all of you," Marcus said, his voice cutting through the silence. He paused briefly, letting the tension build before continuing. "A few days ago, I found myself at an intersection in this very city, a place where citizens cross paths daily, hoping to move forward safely. But instead of safety, I encountered hostility." Greg's heart sank as Marcus recounted the story, not dramatically or angrily, but with calm precision. He described the confrontation, the aggressive tone, and finally, the act of being spat upon. The room grew so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Eyes darted toward Greg, who sat frozen, his face burning with shame. "This wasn't just an attack on me," Marcus continued, his gaze sweeping across the room before settling firmly on Greg. "It was a reflection of deeper issues we need to address. It reminded me why reform is necessary, not just for those outside these walls, but for each of us inside them too." Greg wanted to disappear. Every word Marcus spoke hit like a hammer, forcing him to relive the moment he'd rather forget. Yet there was something else in Marcus's delivery. Not malice, but clarity. This wasn't about revenge. It was about understanding. Still, the weight of accountability pressed down on Greg, heavier than ever. As Marcus wrapped up his speech, he turned back to Greg one last time. "Change starts with acknowledging our mistakes," he said, his voice softer but still firm. "And growth begins when we're willing to learn from them." The room remained silent as Marcus stepped away from the podium. Some officers nodded approvingly, while others exchanged uneasy looks. Greg sat motionless, his hands clenched tightly together. He knew this was only the beginning, a reckoning he couldn't escape. But deep down, a small part of him wondered if maybe, just maybe, this could also be the start of something else. Redemption. In the days following the assembly, Greg's life became a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The weight of Marcus's words hung over him like a storm cloud, impossible to ignore. At first, he tried to brush it off, convincing himself that the incident was blown out of proportion and that people would eventually forget about it. But as whispers followed him down the hallways and sideways glances replaced casual conversations, he realized there was no escaping the reality. His actions had consequences, and now he had to face them. Chief Thompson didn't waste any time addressing the issue directly. A few days after the assembly, Greg was summoned to Marcus's office, a sleek, minimalist space with framed awards and certificates lining the walls. Sitting across from Marcus, Greg felt small, almost insignificant, as if the room itself was closing in on him. Marcus wasted no time getting to the point. "Greg," Marcus began, his tone calm but firm, "what happened at that intersection wasn't just an isolated incident. It was symptomatic of larger problems. Problems we need to fix if this department is going to move forward." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, unsure of how to respond. He wanted to defend himself, to explain that he'd been having a bad day or that the man had provoked him, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew none of those excuses would hold water. "I'm assigning you to sensitivity training," Marcus continued, sliding a folder across the desk. "It's mandatory, and I expect full participation. Beyond that, I want you to lead a pilot program aimed at improving community relations. You'll work closely with local leaders, attend neighborhood meetings, and help bridge the gap between our officers and the people we serve." Greg stared at the folder, his mind racing. Sensitivity training. Leading a program. This wasn't punishment. It was humiliation wrapped in opportunity. Part of him wanted to refuse, to argue that it wasn't fair, but another part recognized the gravity of the situation. If he pushed back, he risked making things worse, for himself and for the department. Over the next few weeks, Greg threw himself into the assignments, albeit reluctantly at first. The sensitivity training sessions were eye-opening, to say the least. Facilitators led discussions on implicit bias, systemic racism, and the importance of empathy in law enforcement. Greg found himself squirming during some exercises, particularly when participants shared personal stories of discrimination and mistreatment by police officers. Their pain was raw, their voices trembling with emotion, and for the first time, Greg began to see the human cost of attitudes like his own. Meanwhile, preparing for the pilot program forced Greg to step outside his comfort zone. He attended community meetings where residents voiced their frustrations about over-policing, racial profiling, and lack of transparency. At one gathering, a young woman stood up and recounted how her brother had been wrongfully arrested years ago, an experience that left lasting scars on her family. Her words struck a nerve, reminding Greg of the ripple effects caused by unchecked power and prejudice. Despite his initial resistance, Greg started to notice subtle shifts within himself. Listening to these stories challenged his assumptions and forced him to confront uncomfortable truths. He realized that many of the people he served viewed him not as a protector, but as a threat, and that realization hit hard. For the first time, He understood why rebuilding trust wouldn't be easy, but also why it was so necessary. Still, doubts lingered. Was this enough to make amends? Could he ever truly earn forgiveness, especially from someone like Marcus? These questions haunted him late at night, keeping him awake long after the lights went out. Yet, through it all, one thing became clear. This journey wasn't just about saving his career. It was about proving to himself that change was possible. As weeks turned into months, Greg's involvement in the pilot program became more than just a task. It transformed into an unexpected journey of self-discovery. Marcus had paired him with a seasoned community liaison named Clara, a woman known for her ability to connect with even the most skeptical residents. Together, they visited neighborhoods that Greg had only ever patrolled in his cruiser, places he previously dismissed as trouble spots. But now, walking through these streets on foot, he began to see them differently. One afternoon, Greg found himself sitting in a small community center, surrounded by teenagers who eyed him warily. Clara introduced him simply as Officer Carson, leaving out the details of his past. At first, the kids were reluctant to engage, their arms crossed and expressions guarded. But when Greg shared a story about his own childhood, how he'd grown up in a tough neighborhood and joined the police force hoping to make a difference, they started to open up. One boy, barely 16, talked about how his older brother had been stopped by police multiple times for no reason other than the color of his skin. Another girl spoke softly about watching her father being handcuffed during a traffic stop, tears welling in her eyes as she recounted the fear she felt that day. Listening to their stories hit Greg harder than he expected. These weren't just complaints or grievances. They were real-life experiences that shaped how people viewed law enforcement. For years, Greg had told himself he was protecting the public, but now he realized how often his actions might have done the opposite. Each conversation chipped away at the walls he'd built around his heart, forcing him to confront the harm caused not only by his behavior, but also by the system he represented. Clara noticed the change in him too. "You're doing better than I thought you would," she admitted one evening after a particularly emotional town hall meeting. "It's not easy to hear these things, especially when you know you've contributed to the problem. But showing up, that's the first step." Greg nodded, though he still struggled with guilt. There were moments when he wondered if he deserved a second chance, given the pain he'd caused. Yet every time he saw someone smile after he helped solve a minor issue, a broken streetlight fixed, a lost wallet returned, he felt a flicker of hope. Maybe redemption wasn't about erasing the past. Maybe it was about building something new, brick by brick. Perhaps the most impactful moment came during a ride along with Marcus. The chief had insisted on joining Greg for a day to observe his progress firsthand. As they drove through the city, Marcus pointed out areas where trust between the community and police had broken down entirely. "These are the places we need to focus on," Marcus said, his voice steady but compassionate. "People here don't hate us because they want to. They hate us because they don't feel safe around us." Later that evening, while stopping at a local diner for coffee, Greg struck up a conversation with an elderly man who recognized him from a recent outreach event. To Greg's surprise, the man thanked him for listening to the community's concerns. "We don't expect perfection," the man said kindly. "Just effort. And I can see you're trying." Those words stayed with Greg long after the shift ended. For the first time, he understood that walking in someone else's shoes wasn't just about empathy. It was about action. Change wouldn't happen overnight, but every small step mattered. And for the first time in years, Greg felt like he was moving in the right direction. The day of the presentation arrived, and Greg stood backstage, his palms sweaty and his heart pounding like a drum. The auditorium was packed. Officers, community leaders, city officials, and even a few reporters had gathered to hear about the progress of the pilot program. This wasn't just another routine update. It was Greg's moment to face judgment, not just from his peers, but from himself. As he waited for his turn to speak, Greg replayed his speech in his mind. He'd spent hours crafting it, rewriting sentences until they felt honest yet respectful. Clara had helped him refine it, offering advice on how to strike the right tone. "Be real," she told him. "People can tell when you're faking it." But no amount of preparation could calm the storm brewing inside him. What if they didn't believe him? What if his words fell flat? When Chief Marcus introduced him, the room grew silent. Greg stepped up to the podium, his uniform feeling heavier than usual. He glanced at the crowd, meeting a sea of eyes that ranged from curious to skeptical. Taking a deep breath, he began. "6 months ago, I stood here as someone who thought he had all the answers," Greg said, his voice steady despite the nerves coursing through him. "I believed my job was black and white. Enforce the law, keep people safe, and move on. But I was wrong." He paused, letting the weight of his admission sink in. Some officers shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned forward, intrigued. Greg continued, recounting the incident at the intersection. The confrontation, the spitting, and the humiliation he inflicted on Marcus. "What I did that day wasn't just disrespectful. It was a reflection of everything I got wrong about this job," he admitted, his voice cracking slightly. "I saw someone different from me and assumed the worst. That's not leadership. That's failure." The room remained silent, hanging onto every word. Greg went on to describe the lessons he learned through sensitivity training and the pilot program. He shared stories from the neighborhoods he'd visited. The teenager who dreamed of becoming a lawyer, the grandmother who thanked him for helping fix her broken streetlight, the man who shook his hand after a town hall meeting. Each story painted a picture of growth, not just for Greg, but for the relationships between the police and the community. "I won't stand here and say I've fixed everything, or that I'm some kind of hero," Greg said, his gaze scanning the room. "But I've started listening, really listening. And what I've heard is hard to hear. It's painful, it's uncomfortable, but it's necessary. If we're going to earn back trust, we have to start by admitting where we failed." When he finished speaking, the room erupted into applause. Not the polite kind, but genuine, heartfelt clapping. Some officers nodded approvingly, while others wiped away tears. Even Marcus, seated near the front, gave him a small, approving smile. Afterward, Greg was approached by several colleagues who congratulated him on his honesty. One older officer, known for his gruff demeanor, simply patted Greg on the shoulder and said, "You did good, kid. Keep it up." Later that evening, Marcus invited Greg to his office for a private conversation. Sitting across from the chief, Greg braced himself for criticism. Instead, Marcus offered measured praise. "You've come a long way," he said. "But remember, this isn't about me forgiving you, or anyone else forgiving you. It's about proving to yourself that change is possible." Greg nodded, absorbing the words. He knew he still had work to do, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right path. A path toward redemption, understanding, and maybe, one day, respect. Months passed, and the changes Greg had helped spearhead began to take root in ways that surprised even him. The pilot program expanded into a citywide initiative, with officers attending regular training sessions on empathy, cultural awareness, and de-escalation tactics. Community meetings became less tense, more collaborative spaces where residents and police worked together to solve local issues. Whether it was addressing rising crime rates or simply fixing broken streetlights. Slowly but surely, trust started to rebuild, one small step at a time. For Greg, life within the department transformed as well. While some colleagues still viewed him with suspicion, others admired his willingness to grow. He wasn't seen as a hero, nor did he expect to be, but there was a newfound respect for his efforts. Younger officers often approached him for advice, curious about how he'd navigated such a difficult journey. "It's not easy," he'd tell them honestly. "But if you're willing to listen, people will meet you halfway." One evening, as Greg walked through a neighborhood he'd once written off as dangerous, he noticed children playing basketball under the glow of newly installed lights, a project born from one of the community meetings. A woman sitting on her porch smiled and waved at him, calling out, "Thanks for helping get those lights fixed." Her words warmed him in a way no medal or promotion ever could. It was proof that progress, no matter how incremental, mattered deeply. Meanwhile, Marcus continued to lead by example, pushing for systemic reforms while maintaining open lines of communication between the department and the public. Though their relationship would never be completely free of tension, Greg felt a quiet understanding develop between them. They weren't friends, but they were allies. Two men working toward the same goal, albeit from different starting points. In quieter moments, Greg reflected on how far he'd come since that fateful day at the intersection. He knew he couldn't undo the harm he'd caused, nor could he erase the memories of those who'd witnessed his cruelty. But what he could do was ensure that his future actions spoke louder than his past mistakes. Every child who felt safe around an officer, every resident who trusted the police enough to report a problem, every handshake exchanged after years of distrust, it all reminded him why this work mattered. Years later, when Greg looked back on his career, he realized something profound. True justice wasn't about punishing wrongdoers. It was about creating opportunities for growth and healing. His story wasn't just about redemption. It was about transformation. And though the scars of his earlier missteps remained, they served as reminders of how far he'd traveled and how much further he needed to go. As Marcus eventually moved on to tackle bigger challenges at the national level, he left behind a legacy of reform and resilience. Before departing, he pulled Greg aside for a final conversation. "You've done good work," Marcus said, his tone warm yet firm. "Don't stop now. Keep fighting for what's right, even when it's hard." Greg nodded, feeling a sense of purpose he'd never known before. He understood now that change wasn't a destination. It was a continuous process, requiring patience, humility, and courage. And as long as he wore the badge, he vowed to honor its meaning, not as a symbol of authority, but as a promise to protect and serve everyone equally. The road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but Greg was ready to walk it, one step at a time.